Happy Monday. I hope you had a great weekend. I have another story for you today. Before we get started, I do have a question of the day or a share. My question is, what is your favorite outdoor activity? As I'm looking out the window, it looks really nice outside and I hope I get a chance to get out in my backyard today. But what is your favorite outdoor activity? Remember, share with anybody around you. Think to self, share with me. Pause the video and take a minute to think. My favorite outdoor activity would probably be walking Marty or going to a park. Just being outside. I love it. I love when the sun is shining. So that is what I like to do. All right, our book today is Mr. Peabody's Apples by Madonna. This is a book that I read as a child, and I love the illustrations in this book and the pictures that it has. This is a really awesome book because I'm going to have you think about something today. A couple weeks back, you can think, turn your brain on and think to a couple weeks back when we were in school, we were learning about theme. And theme, it's not just the main idea of the story, but it's the lesson or the message that the author wants you to take away from a story. And so while I read this to you today, I really want you to think, what does the author want me to take away? What can I learn from this story? So I want you to think of the theme, come up with something by the end of the story. Okay, so Mr. Peabody's Apples. Oh, look at those colors. Mr. Peabody congratulates his Little League team on a great game. In the town of Hatfield, which wasn't a very big town, Mr. Peabody was congratulating his Little League team on a great game. They had not won, but no one really cared because they'd had such a good time playing. Mr. Peabody was the history teacher at the local elementary school, and in the summertime he dedicated every Saturday to organizing baseball games with other schools. Billy Little, who wasn't a very big boy, was one of Mr. Peabody's students. He loved baseball more than anything, and he thought Mr. Peabody was the greatest. After each game, he would always stay to help pick up all the bats and balls. And when they were finished, Mr. Peabody would smile and say, "Thanks, Billy. Good job. I'll see you next Saturday." Then he would start his walk home along the main street of Hatfield, which wasn't a very big street, waving hello to everyone he knew, and everyone would wave hello back. Along the way, he always passed Mr. Funkdale's fruit market. Here, Mr. Peabody would stop and admire Mr. Funkdale's fresh apples. He would pick out the shiniest apple, drop it in his bag, and continue on his way. Across the street, Tommy Tittlebottom watched with curiosity as Mr. Peabody walked away with the apple. "That's strange," Tommy said to himself. "Mr. Peabody didn't pay anyone for the apple." Tommy got on his skateboard and rushed to tell his friends. Mr. Peabody picks the shiniest apple. The following Saturday, Mr. Peabody's team played another game, and they lost, as usual, but no one seemed to care because they'd had such a good time playing. Billy picked up the balls and bats, and Mr. Peabody set off on his walk home. He waved to everyone he knew, and they waved back. Once again, he stopped outside Mr. Funkdale's fruit market, picked up the shiniest apple, dropped it in his bag, and continued on his way. Across the street, Tommy Tittlebottom and his friends watched Mr. Peabody, and they were amazed at what they saw. Mr. Peabody had not paid for his apple. They couldn't wait to tell all their other friends, who told their parents, who told their neighbors, who told their friends in the town of Hapville, which wasn't a very big town. Tommy and his friends were amazed at what they see. The Saturday after that, Mr. Peabody was standing all alone on the baseball field, wondering where everybody was. Then he saw Billy walking toward him with a sad look on his face. "Hello, Billy. I'm glad you're here. But where's the rest of the team?" Mr. Peabody asked. Billy remained silent. "What is it, Billy?" he asked again. Billy didn't look up. "Everyone thinks you're a thief," he said to the ground. Mr. Peabody looked confused. He took off his hat and scratched his head. "Who says I'm a thief, Billy? And what did I steal?" he asked. "Tommy Tittlebottom and his friends said they saw you take an apple from Mr. Funkdale's fruit market twice, and they said that you didn't pay for them," answered Billy. "Ah," said Mr. Peabody, putting his hat back on his head. "Let's go and talk to Mr. Funkdale about it, shall we?" Mr. Peabody wonders where everyone is. Everyone thinks you're a thief. They walked down to Main Street, which wasn't a very big street, and Mr. Peabody waved to all the people he knew, and now some did not wave back, and some pretended they didn't even see him. They finally arrived at Mr. Funkdale's fruit market. Out popped Mr. Funkdale, who said, "Hey, what are you doing here, Mr. Peabody? Why aren't you at the game?" "There wasn't a game today," said Mr. Peabody. "And I was wondering if I could take my apple earlier than usual." "Sure, why not?" replied Mr. Funkdale. "You pay for them every Saturday morning when you pick up your milk. You can take them whenever you'd like. You want the big shiny one, Mr. Peabody?" Mr. Peabody took his apple, smiled, and offered it to Billy. "I would like to take the apple, Mr. Peabody, but I have to go and find Tommy and explain everything," said Billy. "When you find him, ask him to come over to my house. I would like to speak to him too," replied Mr. Peabody. Mr. Peabody offers Billy the apple. A little while later, Billy found Tommy and told him what had happened with the apples. He told Tommy that Mr. Peabody wanted to speak to him right away. So off Tommy ran, and when he arrived, he rang the doorbell. He rang the doorbell, and Mr. Peabody came to the door. They looked at each other for a while. "Oh, dear Mr. Peabody," said Tommy on the doorstep. "I didn't understand. I should not have said what I said, but it looked like you hadn't paid for the apples." Mr. Peabody's eyebrows went up a little, and he felt a warm breeze blow across his face. "It doesn't matter what it looked like. What matters is the truth." Tommy looked down at his shoes and said, "I'm so sorry. What can I do to make things better now?" Mr. Peabody took a deep breath, looked up at a small cloud that was in the sky, and said, "I'll tell you what, Tommy. Meet me at the baseball diamond in 1 hour and bring a pillow stuffed with feathers." "Okay," said Tommy, who then ran off to his house to get a pillow. Tommy rings Mr. Peabody's doorbell. An hour later, Tommy met Mr. Peabody on the pitcher's mound. "Hello, Tommy," said Mr. Peabody. "Follow me and bring me your pillow." Tommy followed Mr. Peabody to the top of the bleachers, wondering what all this was about. "It's a windy day, isn't it?" asked Mr. Peabody. When they reached the top, Tommy nodded his head in agreement. "Here is a pair of scissors. Now cut the pillow in half and shake the feathers out." Tommy looked confused, but he did it anyway. He thought it was a small price to pay to gain Mr. Peabody's forgiveness. The wind carried the thousands of feathers far and wide. Tommy meets Mr. Peabody on the pitcher's mound. I want you to stop and think, why do we think Mr. Peabody had Tommy do this? The wind carries the thousands of feathers far and wide. Tommy looked relieved and said, "Is that all I have to do to make things better?" "There is one more thing," said Mr. Peabody. "Now you must go and pick up all the feathers." Tommy frowned. "I don't think it's possible to pick up all the feathers," Tommy replied. "It would be just as impossible to undo the damage that you have done by spreading the rumor that I am a thief," said Mr. Peabody. "Each feather represents a person in Hapville." There was a long pause as Tommy began to understand what Mr. Peabody was saying. Finally, he said, "I guess I have a lot of work ahead of me." Mr. Peabody smiled and said, "Indeed you do. Next time, don't be so quick to judge a person, and remember the power of your words." Then he handed Tommy the shiny red apple and made his way home. Mr. Peabody makes his way home. The end. So I want you to take a moment to think about, what is the theme of the story? What is the message or the lesson that the author wants you to learn and take away from it? So take a minute and share that. Think it out loud. Talk with somebody about it and share it with them. I hope you guys have an awesome Monday, and remember to be kind to one another.